Professor Rodriguez. I, Professor Rodriguez of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, hereby pledge that my experiment will be conducted in my sole presence. Automation and Xerxes, my brilliant AI assistant, have eliminated the need for a team. For years I revered Rodriguez's genius, but when I begged to witness his project in person, he refused. Too dangerous, he claimed. Instead, he granted me access to its real-time telecast, a privilege reserved for me alone. 15 days out, I visited him daily, brimming with questions. "Patience, Chris," he'd say, brushing me off. "To know too much is to ruin the wonder. Wait for the experiment." 3 days before the event, his message woke me at midnight. "Chris, come to my home at 11 tomorrow. There's something we need to discuss." When I arrived, Rodriguez seemed frayed. His usual composure had fractured, and his voice was unsteady. "I don't feel right about this project," he muttered, hands trembling. "Something's off. It's as if they're waiting." "They?" I asked, unsettled. He shook his head. "Forget it," I reassured him. "Sir, this is your magnum opus. You're about to change history. Don't stop now." He didn't respond, just stared into the distance. The day of the experiment arrived. The live feed flickered to life. At the center of the facility was a massive cube, encircled by calibrated lasers. Rodriguez stood at a distance, his expression unreadable. "It begins," he murmured into the camera. The lasers activated and the cube began to collapse, shrinking rapidly. Xerxes spoke in its chilling monotone. Exotic matter stabilized, wormhole formation imminent. Suddenly the cube disappeared, replaced by a speck of infinite darkness, a wormhole spinning viciously. Rodriguez had done it. Humanity had touched the void. Then disaster struck. The wormhole's pull intensified, alarms blaring. Rodriguez, though standing far from the singularity, began to stretch unnaturally, his body twisting as though space itself betrayed him. "Professor!" I screamed, helpless behind the screen. He was sucked in, but a moment later he re-emerged, staggering to his feet. Relief turned to dread when I saw his face. "Professor?" I whispered. He grinned unnaturally, his voice layered with a guttural hum. "The Professor is gone. I am his twin, an exile from the planet Ariza. For eons, my people have waited to find a planet like yours." My stomach dropped as he continued, his words chilling. "Our planet is a prison, too far to escape. So we sent cells into the cosmos, seeds of intelligence, to create a species that would one day open a gateway like this wormhole. Luckily, you evolved to our desire." He stepped closer to the camera. "Now my kind will come through. Earth is ours." The feed cut to black, leaving me frozen in horror as the weight of his words sank in.
Digital immortality. It was my last hope. All of my appeals failed. My death warrant was signed. My only options became a needle dripping with death or the process. There was a company looking to test a new technology on a human subject, and the state was willing to let them gamble with my life if I was amenable, given that it was already forfeit. They would try to transfer my consciousness from my physical body into the digital world. Of course, it sounded like science fiction, but I was granted a furlough for a day to tour their lab and listen to their scientists before I made my decision. And what they showed me was astonishing. They'd been developing the process for years and had successfully achieved transference on several species of animals already. I was able to interact with a digitized mouse, a dog, a cat, even a chimpanzee. The dog barked through the speakers when it heard me say its name through the microphone. The chimp replied to me in sign language when it saw the gestures I made through the camera. But the most fascinating thing was when they showed me the bodies of these animals. Insanely, they were still alive. They explained that during the early trials, the process had always killed the physical body of the subject. But over the years, they learned to isolate the parts of the brain they were migrating into the digital space, and eventually they could leave behind all of the functions necessary to sustain life, which they claimed was their greatest achievement. I was told that after I was transferred, my still-living body would be the next advancement in scientific and medical research, a completely ethical sandbox for experimentation on a living human. And I would get to live on as lines of code, no longer a threat to society. Though the terrifying question remained if it would truly be me living in the computer. However, I had nothing to lose given the alternative, and I agreed to be their guinea pig. It was an odd sensation being ripped from the corporeal mass I'd inhabited for 47 years, but it worked. I awoke in a world of ones and zeros, yet something was wrong. I could still feel my body. Every poke, every prod they gave it. The pain somehow pinched between the two halves of my now split consciousness. I tried to tell them that they were hurting me, tried to warn them that the process was flawed, but they had investors lined up. Too much money was at stake. The last thing I heard through the microphone was that they'd use an AI chatbot to fake my consciousness when they did the live demonstration for their potential clients, before my brain was filed away in a heavily encrypted external drive. I don't know who my body was sold to. I don't know what it's being used for. But I felt every cut when they began to slice into it.
2 months after my boyfriend died, I saw a crow carrying his torso. Jem died on prom night, alone, crumpled in the road, shattered into pieces. The person who hit him swiped the ring he was going to propose to me with. "We're burying what we could find," I was told at his funeral. What they could find. I thought I was okay, but then I kept hearing his favourite song, smelling his cologne still clinging to my clothes, my car seats, even my own skin. And then I was breaking apart all over again, overwhelmed, suffocating on him, until I couldn't breathe. I wanted to stay with him, even if he was 6 feet under the ground, buried in dirt and surrounded by wilting flowers. Every day I was numb, and I was sick of numb. Every day had no sound. Every day felt like living in a fast-forwarding videotape, and I was the only one awake, alive. 2 months after Jem's death, sound bled back in the form of a loud squawk. Lifting my head, I saw a crow swoop above me. I was mesmerized, even smiling a little, until I glimpsed what was caught between its talons. Scarlet entrails twisted in burned strips of clothing. Something snapped inside me, my legs giving way. Jem's tux. Another crow flew past, its beak twitching. This time, my boyfriend's mutilated torso hung between tiny talons. They'd found him. Before I could stop myself, I threw myself into a run, stumbling over my own feet. The crows touched down deep in the town forest. I thought it was a nest, or worse, that maybe they were eating him. But to my shock, there were bodies. All of them were recently dead kids, and among them was my boyfriend, lying in pieces, half fused together, head attached to his torso. The crows worked effortlessly, hopping across the ground, piecing Jem together like a puzzle. When they finished, they flew away in a flock, taking off into the sky. I dropped to my knees in front of Jem, tears choking my throat. I could take all of him back to his mother. I could bury him whole. I scooped him up, but when he twitched in my arms, I dropped him. "Jem?" I whispered, my trembling hands cradling his face, his flickering eyes, his lips parting in a silent cry. He didn't move, his head slumping, but his chest was twitching. When I rolled him onto his back, something slimy filled my throat. Something was writhing under his skin, raven-black streaks running up and down his spine. I shuffled back as his spine broke through his skin, splitting in two, bulging appendages protruding from his back. Wings. He was beautiful, and yet when Jem turned to me with vacant eyes, beady, almost bird-like, I found myself stepping back. His head twitched, dead eyes staring at me, before he turned and took off into the night. Days later, I was woken by ice-cold air. My window was open, and on my pillow next to me was my ring.
The silent warning. It all started with an innocent photo. A sunset over the lake, beautiful skies, water like glass, the kind of picture that makes you feel calm just looking at it. But when I zoomed in, something in the background caught my eye. A faint glow on the horizon, too bright and sharp to be the sun. I told myself it was lens flare, nothing more, until it appeared in another photo. This time, it was a pic of the forest outside town. The light was there again, faint but unmistakable, hovering just above the treetops like an ember caught mid-flicker. I scrolled through the photos on my camera, a cold pit forming in my stomach. Every picture had the same glow, at the edge of a cornfield, above a quiet neighbourhood, even faintly reflected in a puddle by the roadside. The light wasn't just there, it was getting closer. I started taking pictures obsessively, convinced that if I caught the right angle or lighting, I could explain it. But the more I captured, the worse it got. One morning, I framed the sunny downtown skyline in my lens, hoping for anything ordinary. Instead, I saw it. A mushroom-shaped cloud. It rose like a phantom above the city, its edges blurry, its form incomplete. My breath hitched and I nearly dropped my camera. There had been no explosion, no sound, no shaking earth. Yet there it was, looming silently, but only as an image on my camera. That night I didn't sleep. When I closed my eyes, I saw that cloud, not still but moving. Slowly, deliberately, consuming everything beneath it. The images didn't just linger, they pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat, too vivid to forget. The next day, I avoided my camera, reflections, even looking at the sky. But the glowing image wouldn't leave me. I saw it in the corner of my vision, hovering like an afterimage burned into my retinas. When I glanced at glass windows or polished metal, the cloud stared back at me, faint but growing sharper. I couldn't take it anymore. Just now, I grabbed my camera and stood in the middle of Main Street, desperate for clarity. The sun was shining, the city bustled around me, oblivious. I raised my camera and clicked. The cloud filled the frame. But this time it wasn't blurry anymore. It was vivid, solid, and terrifyingly close. The air suddenly felt thicker, heavy with an electric charge like before a storm. My ears popped, and I realized the city had gone silent. Then the sirens started. Cell phones began to buzz in unison. A message flashed over their screens. Emergency alert, inbound missile detected. Seek immediate shelter. I held up my camera and looked back at its screen. But this time the cloud wasn't in the distance anymore. It was truly here, rising above the skyscrapers, devouring the horizon. My chest tightened. The last thing I heard before the blinding heat consumed me was my shutter clicking again.
Grandma died with dignity at the age of 94 the other day, surrounded by her loved ones. So I don't get why she's come back. She was waiting for me when I returned from the hospice, outside by the door. I barged by her or through her. I was so discombobulated that I don't know which, and went in. She didn't follow me. Just stood by the door. I think she can't come in. I'm certainly not about to ask her. I don't understand why she's doing this to me. She lived a full, respectable life, and she was a catalogue of aches and pains that I can't begin to list. She chose to die freely and openly, after lots of discussion. Well, some discussion. I told her about the option, you see. The medical staff in our region aren't allowed to raise it with patients, after some scandal about homeless or disabled or mentally ill people being pressured into it. I forget which. Some local busybodies took to the press and made a huge fuss, and the sanctimonious old geriatrics who run this place quickly put a fuck-ton of extra rules in place. But there's nothing to say that a loving grandson can't gently talk about the option to his suffering grandma. Especially since Grandma has a nice house, and I was forced to live with my parents. It's the economy, stupid. Until Grandma moved to the hospice and someone, I forget who it was, suggested I might as well move into her house since it was lying empty, and she has all these plants and it can be sorted out later. Oh yes, it will be sorted out. It's later now. And I put the plants out by the pavement the second day. I don't have time to waste on plants, they were dying anyway. Grandma looked at me as I told her, her eyes bright and unclouded. She was wearing a very pretty lacy blue nightgown. It looked expensive. "Thank you, Nicholas," she said deliberately. Mom told me about her decision later that day, struggling to hold back tears. She wants us all there, Nicholas, singing her favourite song. Auld Lang Syne. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes at the attention-seeking old bag. Everything went well. Grandma closed her bright eyes. I was out of there. My parents agreed I could stay in her house until we sort things out. Honestly, I don't think they enjoyed having me with them either. She was there when I returned home. I genuinely thought it was just a random old lady in a blue dress standing by the door. Then I went up, she turned to me, and I froze. She opened her mouth, and I saw very clearly the gaping black hole. I heard her voice, very deliberate and slow. "My plants, Nicholas." The hole grew wider and wider and moved closer to me, starting to swallow me up. I unfroze and barged in. She's still there, standing. I know I can move past her if I move very fast, and I know she's not going anywhere, and neither am I. "Can you hear the voices?" We'd been to the house 2 times in the last month, an old man living with his son. The son, Ronald, had a recent history of cruelty to animals and bizarre outbursts toward other people in the neighborhood. Nothing physical with people, but the sun terrified everyone on the block with insane rantings and ravings about unseen things that were all around them, things they couldn't see. My partner and I were on a wellness check. Neither the old man nor Ronald had been seen in a week. We knocked on the doors, but there was no answer. On a walk around the house, we realized all the windows had black plastic draped over them from the inside. I could also hear the intermittent beep of a smoke alarm with a low battery. The neighbours were all watching us from their lawns. My partner found one window that was slightly cracked. A strong smell of bleach and cigarettes wafted out. There were no lights on inside. She peered in with her flashlight, then turned to me. "Come here. Tell me I'm not crazy." I leaned in to look. Inside, 2 shoes, maybe feet, stuck out as if someone was lying on the floor. On the wall was a figure 8, tipped sideways. We both agreed it had been drawn in blood. After getting confirmation, we broke down the back door. The smoke alarm was the only sound inside. It was filthy. Sideways figure 8s were drawn all over the walls. Some in ink, but most in blood. The air was freezing. The heater was off, and it was 20 degrees outside. We made our way to the front room. Ronald was sitting in a recliner, smoking a cigarette, staring at us. His father was on the floor in a pair of bloody white briefs. I couldn't see an inch of the poor man that hadn't been stabbed. "Can you hear the voices?" Ronald asked, his voice rasping. "They told me I had to stay. Please take me. I'm so hot." Ronald was naked, caked in dry blood. A sideways figure 8 had been carved into his chest with a hunting knife lying on the floor. We took him into custody. The whole time he kept asking if I could hear the voices. At the end of our shift, I was shaking. My partner asked if I was okay. The whole thing had gotten to me. "I can still hear the smoke alarm," I said. She frowned. "I don't remember that." My wife is getting the kids ready for school, and I'm desperately trying to fall asleep. I've taken all the batteries out of our smoke alarms, but one is still beeping. I asked her and the kids if they heard it. They said no. Why would they lie to me? I can't think straight. It's so hot in the house. Why is it so damn hot? Several voices call my name. My kids wanted to go camping. I shouldn't have taken them. "Come on, Dad, let's go." Max and Katie grabbed my hands and dragged me outside. I had just enough time to give my wife Ellie a kiss on the cheek as I was pulled out the door. She shook her head, chuckling indulgently. The kids had been begging me to take them camping. We used to go all the time when they were young, before life got busy. They even had a destination picked out, our favourite spot from when they were little. The story of Ellie and I meeting there had always been their favourite. I parked and we headed past the checkpoint and into the woods. We passed other campers setting up tents, then passed through the campground into the trees. Beyond the forest edge, the trees formed a canopy that blocked out the light, enveloping us in an eerie glow. I started to get an uncomfortable feeling, as if something were off. But Max and Katie were having fun, so we kept going. Despite the low visibility, I led the way, knowing the path by heart from countless visits with Ellie in our youth. But as we approached our spot, my head started to get fuzzy. Things shifted and blurred. Trees both there and not there, the path both clear and overrun with wildlife, and everywhere a palpable feeling of wrongness. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew we needed to leave. Immediately, I turned to the kids, but while I'd been distracted, they'd started down the path. I raced to catch up. "Guys, I think we need to head back." "Come on, Dad, we're almost there. It's just through those trees." With no choice, I followed them. We broke through into a clearing when a wave hit me. Sounds, colours, everything was wrong. I crumpled over, nauseated. When I was done, the kids helped me up. "Are you okay, Dad?" asked Katie. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Actually, you aren't," said Max. "You haven't been for a while." I looked up. They both looked at me with a strange intensity. Then they started pulling me forward toward the clearing. I tried to resist. "You need to see this, Dad. It's past time." They pulled me along until we reached the clearing. Everything was shifting, simultaneously unkempt forest and a well-maintained space. But it was what occupied the space that shook me to my core. No, Max Simmons, beloved son. Katie Simmons, beloved daughter. Ellie Simmons, beloved wife, mother, and light of my life. 3 gravestones. No, this couldn't be real. I took out my phone and called Ellie. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. Suddenly it all came rushing back. The crash. The ambulance. Choosing this spot because it was their favourite. I looked at Max and Ellie. It's time, Dad. You have to let us go. We'll always love you. With that, they shimmered and disappeared. I fell to my knees and wept.
Fermented fingernails. My brother had a bad drug addiction. He'd taken everything from DMT, cocaine, marijuana, heroin, and meth. How his abused body managed to trudge through it all was beyond me. Then, one day, he stopped. Curious, I asked why. Fermented fingernails, man. That'll do it. I cocked an eyebrow. Fermented fingernails? Where the hell did you find that? He shrugged dismissively. I read it on a forum. Apparently some entity appears and slaps you across the face, chiding you over the error of your ways. I wanted to sober myself up, so thought I'd give it a crack. Did you use your own nails? I asked, my stomach churning at the thought. Obviously. The entity can only appear if you allow that which grew out of your affected body to ferment. Bro, it fixes anything. Whatever issue you have, it'll make you straight again, I promise. Months passed. I always thought of my sober brother and his bizarre remedy every night when I sat at the slot machine in my local pub. If fermented fingernails had helped him give up the drugs, I wondered if it would be able to help me break my gambling addiction. I was on my last straw. My account was nearly drained, and my wife was on the verge of leaving me. I allowed my fingernails to grow out longer than usual. When I eventually clipped them, instead of chucking them straight in the bin, I stored them in a glass jar. I added my toenails for good measure. Looking up how to ferment, I learned that you needed to add salt at a 3.5% ratio of the combined weight of water and food to be fermented. I sealed the jar and placed it in a dark cupboard where I left it to ferment for 2 weeks. When it was ready, I eagerly opened the lid. My nose scrunched, and I suppressed the urge to puke when the smell hit me. Wanting to get it over with quickly, I scooped all the nails out and shoved them in my mouth. Fighting my urge to gag, I gulped a mouthful of water and swallowed the nails whole, the definition of a bitter pill. The moment they splashed in my stomach, everything around me went white. My body went stiff as an immense light encapsulated me. A robed entity appeared. It had a pale face, eyes like endless voids, and no mouth or nose. I was torn between it being an alien or some sort of divine creature. Either way, its appearance chilled me. Had I not been paralyzed, I would have shuddered. It stared at me, accusation in its gaze. Then, it slapped me hard across the face. Its voice boomed inside my head. Of all the wonders that God has placed in the world for you to discover, why the fuck would you ferment your own fingernails? Yuck! Get your shit together! Reality suddenly returned, and I never gambled again.
I always wanted the perfect skin. It started in middle school. My classmates were talking about which girl was the ugliest in our class. For sure it's Saya. If it wouldn't be for her acne, she'd look quite decent. So I focused on fixing my skin. Due to hormonal imbalance, I started to see a dermatologist, and I got on Accutane. After my skin dried drastically and peeled off, my acne was practically gone. Then I researched the right skincare routine. I watched a ton of YouTubers and what they used. I begged my parents to buy me products from Korea, and when they arrived, I couldn't contain my excitement. It took me quite a while, but the overall appearance of my skin started to change, but not enough to satisfy me. Even tried to hide my blemishes and scars with makeup. I wasn't satisfied. My classmates started to compliment me for the changes I went through. I could only laugh. Nothing was enough for me. Not the vitamin supplements I took, certain sleep routines I tried, even daily sports activities after years. Nothing seemed to improve my skin further. When I started to miss school, my parents worried. I just couldn't go. It took me many nights to find the right solution. And when I finally found out what I can do, I happily told my parents that I was ready to go back to school again. Relief is what they felt, and so did I. The days and nights were silent right after, but that was okay. My looks changed so much, and when one of the popular girls in my class asked me for advice, I smiled like I never have before, telling her to meet at my house so I could show her. I did not expect her reaction to be horrified. when she visited my house later, but when she tried to call the police, I couldn't let her. So I decided to use her skin too, just like my dear parents. I've read in a forum deep on the web that you are what you eat. And they were right. I achieved the perfect skin. If you have it too, I'd love to have you over at mine.
My wife keeps finding children's toys around the house. We don't have any kids. It was a picture book to begin with. We stared at the big, bold writing, the cartoonish drawing on the hardcover of a children's book we had never purchased. Maybe you accidentally picked it up at the library with your other books, I offered to my wife in a weak explanation. She shrugged non-committedly in response. I found the next item. A small race car, purple and the size of my palm. It was sitting haphazardly on the top step, an accident waiting to happen. I showed my wife, who frowned and offered no explanation, weak or otherwise. Everything started happening rather quickly. Every day we were finding new items, toys, books, dolls. Soon as chucking them out, there would be more toys in their place. We began to suspect each other, of course. It seemed a natural response. It was just us two in the house, so where else could we lay the blame? My breaking point came sooner rather than later. I was mid-shower, mindlessly washing away the stress of everything that had been going on, when I stepped and suddenly slipped. Flying through the shower curtain and landing against the cold, hard tiles, I was thankful we hadn't remodeled the bathroom to a glass shower door. Anger rose when I saw I'd slipped on a plastic bath toy for a child we did not have. This was just beyond ridiculous now. I went to confront my wife, the plastic bath toy in hand. I was pissed, practically shaking in anger, but there was no sign of my wife. I figured she'd gone out without letting me know, but soon nightfall came, but she never returned home. I called my mum, who didn't answer, and left a short voicemail detailing the strange day. I tried to stay up to wait for my wife to return, but must have fallen asleep sometime during the night. The sound of children's laughter and my wife's soft voice singing lullabies woke me. Grogginess cleared to fear and confusion, and I ran about, searching the house desperately for the source of the sounds. I found nothing and no one. I felt like I was going insane. Exhausted and feeling sick with sadness and worry, I eventually crawled into bed as the sun began to rise outside. I resolved to call the police and file a missing persons report when I woke up, if my wife still hadn't returned. I was about to drift off to sleep when my phone buzzed. Thinking it was my wife finally calling to check in, I immediately answered, only to hear my mother's voice on the other end. "I got your voicemail, Harry, but I'm sorry, I honestly don't know what to tell you. Your wife can't be missing because you don't have one. You've never been married, dear."
My daughter wasn't invited. I am so angry right now. Last week, my daughter, Alice, came out of her bedroom in a crying heap. She'd learned through Instagram that her best friend, Hannah, was having a birthday party. There were videos of kids dancing to Sabrina Carpenter, eating chocolate cake, and telling jokes. Every girl in their class had been invited. Every girl except Alice. My daughter is a pickle and can, admittedly, react poorly whenever the attention isn't on her. She's also the sweetest, most dedicated companion anybody could ever hope to have. She'd even made Hannah a personalized scented candle with a photo of them giggling on the side as a gift. I knew Hannah's mom, so I sent a text asking her to explain the situation. Then I told my baby, the center of my entire universe, that we'd have a yes day instead. Basically, I'd say yes to any request within reason, and so we took a long walk along the beach, splurged at an old-school arcade, had dinner at Alice's favorite Mexican restaurant, and finished up with a spa night and ice cream. While this boosted her spirits, now and again her attention would drift back to her phone. Then all that warmth and joy would get zapped straight out of her. The birthday girl's dear mother replied with a dozen lame excuses. Blah, 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 behavioral issues, blah, 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 aggressively lashing out. I had never been so insulted, so I didn't dignify her with a response. To wrap up our yes day, we watched Yellow Jackets in bed with 2 cups of hot chocolate. Unfortunately, that was right when the other girls were settling in for a slumber party at Hannah's place. After Alice cried herself to sleep, I gave her a big, extra-long hug, and seeing her red, puffed-out eyes set a storm raging inside me. It made me want to walk down a horrible path. The next morning, as Alice sat down to breakfast, her eyes went larger than dinner plates. All her friends' stories were paying tribute to the girls at the party and some terrible accident. After a fire broke out at Hannah's place, 5 partygoers died in their sleeping bags, choked by all the fumes. Hannah's parents never made it out of their bedroom. Only Hannah managed to escape, although by the time the fire brigade arrived, her eyeballs had melted out of their sockets. She's still in critical condition at the hospital, and my baby is insisting we go visit as soon as we're allowed. Now Alice is saying she wants to visit Hannah and gift her the special candle she had made. I told her not to worry, though. I'm sure a naked flame is the last thing Hannah wants around her right now.
I am the collector who will collect your memory once you die. I collected memories from the dead, memories to give to people. They relive the same exact experiences, senses, and emotions they feel. The dead's memories are different, so I gather them in different jars before labeling them. Happy, sad, mad. These are just a few examples. I visited the man I had called out, holding the tarot card I gave him, gliding on the side, catching my eye. He looked over at me and smiled. 10 of Swords, huh? He laughed. You really are an interesting fellow, still dressed like that. Good afternoon, Brian. Do you mean my black suit or my gloves? It's only appropriate for the collector, eh? He mocked. The collector of memories, actually, I corrected. So tell me how to get in this business. You give people tarot cards and they pay you, right? Not exactly, Brian. See, I give them tarot cards according to the feelings of someone that passed away, and they thank me by paying me. I was often called a sham, and some refused to pay, so I had to open the jar for them. Really? For example, before meeting you, I showed a mother her daughter's murderer and the fear she felt. The mother cried, but she lived through it all because she loved her daughter so much, and to properly mourn her. Yeah, sure. I'll hold these weird jars you hold and dress like I'm from the 19th century, Brian said. He reached for the jar I held, and I raised it. Not yet. Do you know what the 10 of Swords means? I asked. Because I just left jail, right? I'm innocent, asshole. Brian's brows furrowed. How much is the job? It's not exactly a job, I whispered. It's a pity you misunderstood, but it was a job only you can do, not a career. Then give me the job. I grinned. Don't forget you asked for this, Brian. I opened the jar and the Pikeville killer fell down, seizing. Maybe he lived the fear of the girl as she ran from him. Maybe the bone getting broken. Maybe the fear and last wishes of the killed, wishing they could escape from the hell they were in. The poor daughter. I left the jar next to Brian, carefully labelled the victims.
It's cold sometimes. I was a sickly child before I died. Maybe that's why the cold hurt me so easily. But the fire was only lit when my father wanted it, and he'd rather spend his money on things other than flames. Could we have the fire, please? I asked once. I'm so cold. Are you training for the fires of hell, boy? Don't be ungrateful. Your blanket should be enough for you. I was huddled up in a blanket that couldn't trap warmth that my frozen skin wasn't losing. I knew that my dad had a good job, but he made me live as though we had nothing. On my final day, I was filled with fever. My skin felt scalding hot even as I saw my breath hang in the air, and I was so scared that hell had found me. Instead, death is just a muted echo of all that takes place for the living. I watched my parents find my corpse, and not once since that day have I walked through the hell my father described to me. The skin of my ghostly form never burns away from me, as he said it might, and my eyes never drip melted from their sockets. It's even cold sometimes. With nowhere in particular to go, I stayed in the home and watched my parents live. Over time and many overheard conversations, I began to understand the ways that they'd wronged me. My parents argued, and I found out that father's money was being wasted on gambling. My mother's friend visited her, and I learned that adults had worried about me, but my mother had lied to cover for my father over and over. Slowly, I realized that I could just barely affect the realm of the living. A reflection of myself in my mother's mirror, a cup nudged off the table, an audible screech of rage in the night. My mother left in fear. My father took up drinking, and it was on a night when he had thoroughly indulged in this sin that I took my revenge. The fire was lit as he slept, as was his right alone, and I knocked one of its embers onto the floor. As the house went up in flames, it felt nothing but pleasantly warm to me. But as I touched Father's dying flesh, it was a furnace, and I knew where he was headed. The bones of the house were still good despite the fire, and so after a time it was inhabited again. I stayed and watched generations come and go right up until today. Today, the house's occupants are echoes of the family I remember, a child needing help, and a parent offering only hatred. I can't guarantee a happy life for the child, for I can't be there for her. Anything could happen to the girl once she leaves. The only thing that I can promise is that after tonight, her mother will never feel the cold again. Let me know if you'd like to make any changes.
I've never seen my wife this happy before, and it's starting to worry me. I watched her through the window, laughing in the garden. Her laughter wasn't melodic. It was brittle, cracking through the air like snapping twigs. Rachel had always been practical, reserved even, but in the last few days she'd transformed into someone I hardly recognized. At first, I chalked it up to her new museum job, cataloguing ancient artifacts. She came home flushed with stories of forgotten relics, her excitement spilling into long monologues. Then, a few nights ago, she brought it home. The mask. It was grotesque. Blackened with age, its surface carved with swirling patterns that shimmered faintly. But its grin unnerved me most, impossibly wide, with jagged teeth etched deep into the wood. "It's for inspiration," she said, setting it on the mantel. "Isn't it delightful?" I didn't respond. That night, I dreamed of her standing at the foot of our bed, the mask in her hands. Her face was hidden in shadows, but her laughter rang dry and hollow. When I woke, the mask had shifted on the mantel, its smile tilted as though mocking me. By the third day, Rachel stopped coming to bed. I'd find her in the living room at odd hours, murmuring to the mask, her fingers tracing its edges while candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Rachel, you haven't been yourself lately." "That mask," I began this morning. "It listens to me," she interrupted, her voice low but fervent. "It knows me." "You're scaring me," I said, reaching for her. She recoiled. "Don't touch me," she snapped, her eyes wild. "You don't understand. You never have." The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. Now, as I watched her from the window, her laughter rang louder, climbing to a pitch that made my neck prickle. She was barefoot, spinning in lazy circles, her head thrown back. The mask, strapped tightly to her face, gleamed under the moonlight. I stepped outside, the scent of damp earth thick in the air. "Rachel," I called, my voice trembling. "Take that thing off." She froze mid-spin, her head snapping toward me unnaturally fast. The mask's hollow eyes locked onto mine. "I can't," she said softly. Her voice was layered now, her usual tone intertwined with something deeper, raspier. "It's a part of me." Her hands reached for the mask's edges, but instead of removing it, she pulled it tighter. Her laughter erupted again, a sound too large for her small frame. It filled the garden, the house, the world. And then she was gone. All that remained was the mask, lying in the grass, its jagged smile turned upward. I signed up for a medical study. 2 weeks later, everyone else in the program is missing. I needed the money. The ad promised $5,000 for 2 weeks of medical observation. Easy, low risk, nothing experimental, just a cognitive enhancer to improve focus and memory. There were 12 of us, isolated dormitory, daily checkups, harmless at first. By day 4, the effects kicked in, memories resurfaced with perfect clarity. Conversations slowed. I could anticipate what people would say before they said it. I started hearing things I shouldn't, the hum of fluorescent lights, the whisper of pages flipping across the room. By day 7, it wasn't amazing anymore. Shadows moved in the corners. Voices murmured at night. Jeremy swore. Someone stood at the foot of his bed. "It wasn't a shadow," he whispered the next morning, shaking. "It was a man. He looked just like me." That night, Jeremy vanished. His things were still there, phone, wallet, even his half-drunk coffee. When we asked the researchers about him, they frowned. Who? More disappeared. One by one. No trace, no records, no memory of them except in my own head. I started keeping notes, names, descriptions, voices, trying to hold on to proof they ever existed. But by the next morning, even my handwriting looked unfamiliar. By day 11, only 3 of us remained. We tried to leave. The doors led nowhere. No parking lot, no road, just black stretching into infinity. Sarah screamed, throwing a chair into the abyss. It didn't fall, it didn't land, it just ceased to exist. The quiet guy turned to me, pale. "We were never outside," he whispered. "We've been here the whole time." Then he was gone. Day 12. Sarah isn't Sarah anymore. She sits on the bed, rocking back and forth, whispering in a language I don't recognize. The researchers still come in, pretending everything is fine. They smile too much. Their faces stretch too thin. This wasn't a study. It was a filter to see who would vanish and who would remain. Day 14. I wake up to a new invitation. Elegant cardstock, same as before. Just 2 words, "Welcome aboard." And below it, a list of names. Names I don't recognize. Names that in 2 weeks won't exist anymore. My twin sister Tina and I were sitting around the coffee table with Haley, Jenny, Anna, and Michelle. On the table between all of us was a Ouija board. While Jenny and Anna accused each other of pushing the planchette around the board, Michelle sat back and said, "I don't think we should be doing this." "I agree." Tina fixed her eyes on mine. "It's dumb. I think we should go." She hooked her thumb over her shoulder. "I think we should stay," I replied. "It's not like we have anything better to do." "You can leave if you want," Haley said to Michelle. "It's okay if you're too scared to continue." "I'm not scared," Michelle insisted, but we could tell from the tremble in her voice that she was. "Let's try it again," Jenny said, "and this time nobody better push it." She eyed Anna when she spoke. "I didn't push it," Anna snapped. "You did." "Will you two just stop?" Haley interrupted before they could start their argument again. Tina looked over at me and rolled her eyes, making me regret that I had invited her. "Everyone put your fingers back on the planchette," Haley instructed. Michelle was the last one to obey. "What should we ask the spirit?" Haley addressed the group. "We should probably ask if it's still here," Anna said. "It might have left after having to listen to Jenny whine about me pushing the planchette." "That would have been the smart thing for the spirit to do," Tina quipped. "Will you stop?" I said to her. "You don't have to stay." While I addressed Tina, Jenny made a face at Anna but thankfully didn't say anything back. "Everyone shut up," Haley said. Once she was certain nobody else was going to speak, she said, "Spirit, are you still with us?" I reached out and pushed the planchette over to the word yes. As soon as I stopped pushing it, Anna and Jenny started bickering about who they thought had moved the planchette again. "This is such a waste of time." Tina got to her feet. "They are never going to believe we're the ones pushing it." She walked off, disappearing through a nearby wall. She was right, but I didn't want the night to be a total waste, so I used the last of my energy to fling the Ouija board off the table before I left.